The sun was setting over the small Texas town when a military staff sergeant walked into O'Malley's bar and grill, his perfectly pressed uniform catching the warm glow of the neon beer signs in the window. He just finished a long day of training new recruits at the nearby base, and his shoulders carried the weight of responsibility that came with molding young soldiers into America's future defenders. O'Malley's wasn't fancy by any means, just your typical local watering hole where the wooden floor had seen decades of boot prints, and the air smelled like a mixture of draft beer and old leather. The walls were covered with faded photographs of local sports teams and military units that had passed through over the years. Behind the bar, an American flag hung proudly, its edges slightly curled from years of exposure to cigarette smoke from back when indoor smoking was still allowed. The sergeant chose a spot at the far end of the counter, nodding politely to the bartender, a gray-haired man with kind eyes who'd probably heard more stories than any therapist in town. Around him, the evening crowd was starting to filter in. A couple of off-duty mechanics still in their oil-stained work shirts, a group of office workers loosening their ties after a long day, and some locals who looked like they could tell you every story about every scratch on the pool table in the corner. As he settled onto the worn leather bar stool, the sergeant ordered a glass of water. He was still in uniform, after all, and he took that responsibility seriously. The ice clinked against the glass as the bartender set it down, offering a friendly "here you go, Sergeant," that carried the warmth of someone who'd served plenty of military folk over the years. The evening had that comfortable small-town feel to it. Someone had just loaded up the jukebox with classic country songs, and the soft twang of guitars mixed with the occasional crack of pool balls and laughter from a group sharing jokes at a corner table. A baseball game played silently on the TV mounted above the bar, though nobody seemed to be paying much attention to it. The sergeant pulled out his phone, checking messages from his family back home. His mother had sent him a photo of his little sister's college graduation. Another reminder of why he'd chosen to serve, to protect moments like these. As he typed out a reply, the door hinges creaked, and a cool breeze swept through the bar, carrying with it the rumble of motorcycle engines growing louder outside. The regular customers seemed to notice the change in the air first. The laughter at the corner table died down a bit, and a few glances were exchanged between the longtime patrons. Even the bartender's hands slowed as he wiped down glasses, his eyes drifting toward the door. The sergeant didn't look up from his phone, but years of training had taught him to notice everything. The sudden tension in the room, the way conversations dropped to whispers, the sound of heavy boots approaching the entrance. The old screen door opened with a long squeak, and the sergeant could feel a shift in the atmosphere even before he saw who was walking in. The jukebox had just switched to a Merle Haggard song about freedom, and somewhere in the back, a pool cue missed its shot, the ball rolling quietly across the green felt. This was the moment when an ordinary evening at O'Malley's Bar and Grill was about to become something else entirely, something that would leave its mark on everyone present, though none of them knew it yet. The peaceful buzz of the regular crowd was about to change, and the sergeant's quiet evening was going to turn into something that nobody in O'Malley's would soon forget. The heavy boots hit the wooden floor like thunder as three men from the local motorcycle club walked in. Their leather vests were covered in patches, some showing their club status, others displaying messages that made a few customers look away uncomfortably. The tallest one, with a gray beard reaching down to his chest, led the group. Behind him came two younger guys, both sporting fresh tattoos on their necks and arms that told stories of their own beliefs. The bar seemed to shrink as they entered. A young couple who'd been enjoying their dinner quietly gathered their things and slipped out the side door. The bartender started wiping the same glass he'd been cleaning for the past 5 minutes, his eyes darting between the bikers and the sergeant who still sat calmly at the counter. "Turn that music up," one of the younger bikers shouted, making his way to the jukebox. The older songs were quickly replaced by heavy metal, played loud enough to make conversation difficult. But maybe that was the point, to make sure everyone could hear the comments they started making, just loud enough to reach the sergeant's ears. "Ain't what it used to be around here," the tall one said, his voice carrying over the music. "They're letting anybody in uniform these days." His friends laughed, the sound sharp and unfriendly. The sergeant kept his eyes forward, taking another sip of water. His reflection in the mirror behind the bar showed no reaction, but anyone watching closely might have noticed his jaw tighten slightly. He'd faced worse in his career, much worse, but sometimes the hardest battles are the ones fought with patience and dignity. A few regular customers who'd been playing pool set their cues down and moved closer to the bar, forming a subtle barrier between their usual crowd and the newcomers. Nobody wanted trouble, but everybody could feel it brewing like an approaching storm. The bikers ordered their drinks and chose a table close to the sergeant, dragging their chairs across the floor noisily. They weren't trying to hide their intentions. Every scrape of those chair legs was a challenge. Every loud laugh was meant to provoke. "Remember when people knew their place?" one of them said, clinking his beer bottle against his friend's. "Now they're getting them stripes and letting them give orders." The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and toxic. The old bartender, who'd seen his share of trouble over the years, moved closer to the sergeant's end of the bar. He started arranging bottles that didn't need arranging, making it clear where he stood without saying a word. A few other veterans in the bar, you could tell by their haircuts and the way they carried themselves, also shifted their positions, creating a silent network of support. The bikers noticed all this, and it seemed to fuel their anger. The tall one stood up, his chair scraping backward. He was a big man, probably 6'4", with hands like baseball gloves and arms covered in faded military tattoos. The irony of a former service member showing such disrespect wasn't lost on anyone. Time seemed to slow down as he walked toward the bar, deliberately bumping against other customers' chairs along the way. His heavy footsteps echoed despite the loud music, each step bringing him closer to what everyone knew would be a turning point in the evening. The sergeant could see him approaching in the mirror, could read the intention in every heavy step. The room held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Even the jukebox seemed to hit a quiet spot between songs, as if the machine itself knew something important was about to happen. Years of military training had taught the sergeant how to handle hostile situations, but this was different. This wasn't a battlefield or a training exercise. This was about something deeper, something that had been brewing in this country for generations. And how he handled the next few moments would matter, not just for tonight, but for everyone watching, for every story that would be told about what happened at O'Malley's on this particular evening. The tall biker made his final approach to the bar, his heavy silver rings clicking against his beer bottle with each step. The sound echoed through the now quiet room as he positioned himself right next to the sergeant's seat. A strong smell of leather and motor oil surrounded him as he deliberately knocked his elbow against the sergeant's arm. "Oops," he sneered, not even trying to make the bump seem accidental. "Didn't see you there." The lie hung in the air like a challenge, but what happened next surprised everyone. The sergeant didn't jump up or show anger. Instead, he turned slowly in his seat, his movements calm and controlled. His eyes weren't focused on the biker's face or his threatening stance. They were fixed on something specific on the leather vest. The sergeant's gaze moved across the patches, studying each one with the kind of attention that only comes from personal understanding. There, among the various badges and symbols, was a patch that stood out from the rest. A combat unit insignia from Vietnam, slightly faded, but still clear enough to read. The sergeant's expression changed ever so slightly, a flash of recognition crossing his face. The biker noticed this careful inspection, and his face reddened. "What are you looking at?" he demanded, taking a half-step closer. His two friends had risen from their table, ready to join in if needed. The entire bar seemed to be holding its breath. 588th Combat Support Battalion, the sergeant said quietly, his voice steady and clear. "Second tour, 68 to 69, if I'm reading that patch right." The biker's aggressive stance faltered for just a moment, surprise flickering across his weathered face. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again, as if he couldn't quite figure out how this soldier knew such specific details about his service history. "What's it to you?" he growled, but there was something different in his voice now. A hint of uncertainty where there had been only anger before. His fingers unconsciously touched the patch the surgeon had mentioned. The other customers watched this exchange with growing interest. The jukebox had gone quiet, leaving only the soft hum of the beer coolers and the distant sound of traffic outside. Even the bikers' friends seemed unsure of what to do, their usual backup routine thrown off by this unexpected turn of events. "That unit saw some of the heaviest action around Sagan," the sergeant continued, his voice taking on a tone of respect that couldn't be faked. "Especially during the summer of '68. They called it the burning season, didn't they?" The tall biker's hand dropped to his side, his aggressive posture softening almost imperceptibly. Something had shifted in the air between these two men, like a key turning in a long-rusted lock. "How do you?" the biker started, then stopped. His eyes narrowed as he really looked at the sergeant for the first time, not just seeing the color of his skin or the uniform he wore, but seeing something else, something that connected them across years and battlefields and all the things that should have kept them apart. The bartender had stopped pretending to clean glasses now, watching openly like everyone else. The two younger bikers exchanged confused glances, sensing that their planned confrontation had somehow veered into unexpected territory. 20 men, the sergeant said softly. 20 men made it out of that ambush near the river. One of them was my uncle. He reached slowly into his uniform pocket, and everyone in the bar tensed for a moment until they saw what he was pulling out. An old, worn photograph. The tall biker stared at the surgeon's hand, at the photograph he hadn't seen yet, but somehow already knew would change everything about this evening. His own hands, which had been clenched into fists just moments before, slowly relaxed at his sides. The noise from outside, passing cars, distant sirens, the normal sounds of a small-town evening, seemed to fade away. In O'Malley's bar and grill, time stood still as two men from different worlds found themselves standing at a crossroads neither of them had expected to find. The photograph was creased and yellowed, worn soft at the edges from years of handling. The sergeant held it out carefully, like he was offering something precious. In the dim bar light, the image showed a group of soldiers standing in front of a helicopter, their young faces covered in dust and determination. "Third row, second from the right," the sergeant said quietly. "That's my uncle." And right next to him. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The tall biker's face had already changed, the anger draining away like water through sand. "Doc," the biker whispered, using the old nickname from decades ago. "Your uncle was Doc." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. He reached for the photo with hands that had been balled into fists just moments before, but now trembled slightly as they held the old picture. The other bar patrons watched in amazement as the big man's tough exterior crumbled. His fingers traced over the faces in the photograph, touching each one as if remembering old friends. "Doc saved more lives than any medic in our unit," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Never cared what color anybody was when they were bleeding." The sergeant stood up slowly, reaching his full height. "He told me stories about a soldier who carried 3 wounded men through enemy fire to reach the evacuation point," he said. "Said that man had hair as red as a sunset and cursed like a sailor." He paused, looking at the biker's now gray beard. "Though I guess the red's mostly gone now." The biker let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Doc talked about me." His friends at the back table looked completely lost now, their earlier bravado forgotten as they watched their leader transform before their eyes. "Every Thanksgiving," the sergeant replied. "Called you the bravest fool he ever met." He smiled slightly. "Said you were too stubborn to know when to be scared." The bartender had stopped pretending to be busy, openly watching like everyone else. The regular customers who had been tensed for trouble now leaned forward, caught up in this unexpected story unfolding before them. I tried to find him after the war, the biker admitted, still staring at the photo. Lost touch during all the chaos coming home. Things were different back then. His voice carried years of regret. He looked for you too, the sergeant said softly. Kept checking veteran reunions, military records. Said he had a debt he needed to repay. The biker looked up sharply. Debt? He didn't owe me anything. I was just doing what needed doing. He shook his head, memories clearly playing behind his eyes. It was your uncle who pulled me out when my chopper went down 2 months later. Ran through open ground under heavy fire. Should have gotten a medal for that. Other veterans in the bar had moved closer now, drawn by the shared understanding of what these men were talking about. The kind of bonds formed in combat that run deeper than any differences. He did get a medal, the sergeant said. Never wore it though. Said the only reward he needed was knowing you made it home. He paused, taking a deep breath. He passed away last spring. Still had that photo on his bedside table. The biker's hands tightened on the photograph, but gently, carefully, as if holding something sacred. The hatred and anger that had filled the bar earlier seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by something more powerful. The weight of shared history and lost chances. Behind them, one of the biker's friends shifted uncomfortably, knocking over an empty bottle. The small sound seemed to break the spell, bringing everyone back to the present moment. But things weren't the same anymore. They couldn't be, not after what had just been revealed. The tall biker looked around the bar as if seeing it for the first time, perhaps noticing the faces that had been watching this exchange. Faces of all colors, all backgrounds, all united in their witness to this unexpected reunion of sorts. The old jukebox clicked and whirred, switching to a slow country song that seemed to fit the moment perfectly. The biker pulled up a bar stool, his leather vest creaking as he sat down. His entire body language had changed, the threatening stance replaced by the weight of memories. Your uncle, he started, then had to clear his throat before continuing. He never gave up on anybody. There was this one night, near the river. He trailed off, looking down at his weathered hands. We'd been taking heavy fire for hours. Had 3 men hit bad. Real bad. The sergeant nodded, recognizing the story from his uncle's tellings around family dinners. He signaled to the bartender, who brought over 2 glasses of water without being asked. Some stories needed clear heads to be told properly. Rain was coming down so hard you couldn't see 3 feet ahead. The biker continued, his voice taking on the distant tone of someone traveling back in time. Mud everywhere. The medevac couldn't get in. But your uncle, he just kept working. Kept those boys alive with nothing but basic supplies and pure stubbornness. Other veterans in the bar had drawn closer, forming a loose circle around them. They understood what was happening here. Old wounds being opened, but maybe, finally, starting to heal properly. I remember him singing, the biker said, a small smile touching his lips. Right there in all that chaos, he'd be singing gospel songs while he worked. Said his mama taught him that music could heal the soul while medicine healed the body. The sergeant smiled. That sounds like him. He used to sing at every family gathering. Didn't matter if he knew the words or not. He paused, then added, he sang those same songs in his final days. The biker's 2 friends had moved closer too, their earlier hostility forgotten in the face of this unexpected story. One of them, the younger one with the neck tattoos, looked almost ashamed now, understanding perhaps for the first time the real cost of the hatred they'd brought into the bar. We all looked the same in the dark, the biker said quietly, his fingers tracing the rim of his water glass. Covered in mud and blood and rain. Your uncle, he'd touch each wounded man's face, tell them they were going to make it home. Didn't matter what color that face was under the mud. We were all just scared kids a long way from home. An older woman at a nearby table wiped her eyes quietly. Her husband, wearing a Korean War veteran's cap, reached over and squeezed her hand. They'd lived through these kinds of stories themselves. Last thing he said to me, before we lost touch, the biker continued, his voice growing hoarse, was that we had to remember what we learned over there. About looking out for each other. About how blood runs the same color in everybody. He shook his head slowly. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that lesson. Let bitterness cloud everything else. The sergeant listened silently, letting the man work through his memories. Sometimes the best thing you can do is just be present while someone finds their way back to their better self. Your uncle, the biker said, finally looking up to meet the sergeant's eyes. He saved more than just lives out there. He saved our humanity. Showed us what real strength looks like. He glanced down at the patches on his vest, particularly at ones that suddenly seemed to carry a different weight. And here I am, all these years later, dishonoring everything he taught us. The bar had fallen completely quiet now, even the regular background chatter silenced by the power of what was unfolding. The afternoon sunlight slanting through the windows had shifted, casting long shadows that seemed to connect everyone in the room, regardless of where they sat or what they wore or what color their skin might be. The biker's hands moved to his vest, fingers touching the patches that had seemed so important just minutes ago. His weathered face showed the inner battle he was fighting. Years of anger and prejudice crashing against the flood of memories about a man who'd saved his life without once asking about the color of his skin. Your uncle, he said, voice rough with emotion, he pulled me out of a burning helicopter. Never told you that part of the story, did he? He took a shaky breath before continuing. February 16th, 1969. I can still smell the fuel and smoke. The sergeant leaned forward slightly, hearing a story his uncle had never shared. Around them, the bar remained silent, everyone drawn into this moment of truth. We'd taken fire during a supply run. Went down hard in enemy territory. I was pinned in the cockpit, leg crushed under the controls. The biker's hand unconsciously moved to his right thigh. Fire was spreading fast. Could feel the heat getting closer. Thought that was it for me. He paused, taking a sip of water with unsteady hands. His two friends had removed their own vests, laying them quietly on a nearby chair, the symbolic gesture not lost on anyone watching. Then I hear this voice through the smoke. Your uncle, he'd seen us go down. Ran half a mile through open terrain, under fire, to reach us. The biker shook his head in disbelief, even after all these years. He crawls into that burning wreck, tells me to keep breathing, that he's getting me out no matter what. A tear rolled down his cheek, but he didn't bother wiping it away. Fire's getting worse, metal's so hot it's burning through our uniforms. But he keeps working, using a piece of broken door as a lever to free my leg. Whole time, he's humming that gospel song of his, Amazing Grace. The sergeant nodded, remembering how his uncle would hum that same tune while tending his garden in peacetime. Some habits never left a person. When he finally got me free, we both knew my leg was bad. But your uncle, he didn't hesitate. Threw me over his shoulder like a sack of rice and started running. Enemy fire kicking up dirt all around us. The biker's voice cracked. I asked him later why he risked it. You know what he said? The question hung in the air. Even the bartender had stopped pretending to work, standing still with a towel frozen in his hands. He said, because that's what brothers do. The biker's voice was barely above a whisper now. Brothers. Not black man, not white man. Just brothers. He looked down at his vest again, at the patches that had defined him for so long. With hands that had stopped shaking, he began removing them, one by one. Each one that came off seemed to lighten something in his face, like taking off armor he no longer needed to wear. Been carrying the wrong kind of weight, he said, almost to himself. Your uncle tried to teach me what really matters, and I forgot. Got lost in anger, in blame, in everything that divides us. He placed the patches in a pile on the bar. No more. His friends watched him, then started removing their own controversial patches. The sound of Velcro ripping seemed to echo in the quiet bar, each tear like the breaking of an old chain. "I never did thank him properly," the biker said, finally looking up to meet the surgeon's eyes, "for saving my life that day, and for trying to save my soul with that lesson about brotherhood." The late afternoon sun streaming through the windows caught the metals on the surgeon's uniform, making them shine. But it was the compassion in his eyes that truly lit up the room. The mood in O'Malley's had shifted completely. What started as a potential fight had transformed into something like a reunion. Other customers who'd been holding their breath, expecting trouble, now moved closer to listen as stories began flowing between the surgeon and the biker. "Your uncle," the biker said, now comfortable in his seat. "He had this way of making everybody laugh, even on the worst days. Remember this one time, middle of a monsoon, we're all miserable, soaked to the bone." He starts telling this story about his first fishing trip. The surgeon's face lit up, the one with the rubber boots and the catfish. "That's it." The biker laughed, the sound genuine and warm. He told that story like it was the funniest thing that ever happened. Had us all rolling, even with rounds flying overhead. Some of the regular customers had pulled their chairs closer, drawn into the stories. The bartender brought over fresh waters, along with some bowls of pretzels, making it feel more like a family gathering than a bar scene. He kept those stories going through the worst nights, the biker continued, his voice softening with memory. When the rain wouldn't stop and the jungle felt like it was closing in, he'd tell us about Sunday dinners back home. About his mama's sweet potato pie and his dad's backyard barbecues. The surgeon nodded, smiling. Those Sunday dinners were real. Aunt would always save him the biggest piece of pie when he came home on leave. Said a growing boy needed his sweets. One of the younger bikers, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. "Sir," he addressed the surgeon hesitantly. I. He struggled with his words, shame evident on his face. "What we did earlier, how we acted." The surgeon raised his hand gently. "Sometimes the hardest step is admitting when we're wrong. Takes real courage to do that." The older biker reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. From it, he carefully removed an old, creased piece of paper. "Been carrying this for over 40 years, he said, unfolding it carefully. "Your uncle wrote it the day after the helicopter incident." The paper was yellowed with age, the creases so worn they were almost falling apart. On it, in faded ink, was a simple message. "Brothers in blood, brothers in life, keep the faith." At the bottom was a small drawing of a medic's cross. Other veterans in the bar had gravitated closer, sharing quiet nods of understanding. One older man in a Korean war cap wiped his eyes discreetly. His wife squeezed his hand, knowing he was remembering his own brothers in arms. "He had this dream," the biker said, carefully refolding the note. "Said that one day we'd all remember what we learned over there. That when you're fighting for survival, when you're carrying your wounded brother, skin color doesn't matter. Background doesn't matter. Nothing matters except that we're all human, all in it together." The late afternoon light had shifted to early evening, casting long shadows across the bar floor. Someone had put on a soft country song about coming home, and it seemed to fit the moment perfectly. The younger bikers listened intently, their earlier hostility replaced by something like understanding. One of them got up and gathered all the removed patches, putting them in a paper bag, not as treasures to keep, but as remnants of a mindset they were leaving behind. "Your uncle," the older biker said, his voice thick with emotion, "he never got to see his dream come true. But maybe, just maybe, we can help make it happen. One story at a time, one changed mind at a time." The biker sat quietly for a moment, staring into his glass of water as if seeing his reflection for the first time in years. His shoulders, which had carried such aggressive tension earlier, now slumped with the weight of understanding. "You know," he said softly, "after the war, I came home angry. Everything felt wrong. Couldn't sleep, couldn't settle. Started blaming everyone else for how messed up I felt inside. He paused, running a hand through his gray beard. It was easier to be angry than scared. Easier to hate than to deal with the nightmares. The sergeant listened patiently, recognizing the struggle in the man's voice. Around them, the bar had become something like a confessional, with everyone listening in respectful silence. Your uncle, he tried to warn me about that. Last time I saw him, before we lost touch, he said something I didn't understand back then. The biker's voice grew distant with memory. Said that hate was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Didn't make sense to me at the time. One of the younger bikers spoke up, his voice unusually soft. Boss, all these years you've been, we thought. He couldn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. They'd followed his lead, never questioning why their mentor carried so much anger. I led you boys down the wrong path, the older biker admitted, turning to face his friends. Got so caught up in being angry that I forgot what real strength looks like. He gestured toward the sergeant. Real strength is what this man's uncle showed us. Running into fire to save someone different from you, that's courage. That's humanity. The bartender, who had been quietly listening, moved closer. My dad was in Vietnam too, he shared. Used to say the same thing, that fear turns to anger if you don't face it head-on. The evening light filtering through the windows had turned golden, casting long shadows across the bar floor. Someone had put on an old peace song from the 60s, and nobody moved to change it. After that helicopter crash, the biker continued, his voice growing stronger. I spent 6 months in a military hospital. Different doctors, nurses, all colors, all backgrounds. They all worked just as hard to save my leg, to help me walk again. He shook his head slowly. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that too. The sergeant reached out and placed a hand on the biker's shoulder, a gesture that would have been unthinkable an hour ago. It's never too late to remember, he said simply. The younger bikers watched this exchange, then one by one began sharing their own stories. About family members who'd served, about moments of kindness they'd experienced from people they'd been taught to hate, about their own struggles with anger and fear. Your uncle, the older biker said, turning back to the sergeant. He saved more than just my life that day in the helicopter. He tried to save my soul too. Took me this long to understand that. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, not caring who saw. Been carrying this weight of hatred for so many years, telling myself it was about pride, about tradition. But really, it was just fear. Fear of facing what the war did to me inside. The bar had grown darker outside, but inside, something was growing lighter, as if a heavy cloud that had hung over everyone was finally starting to lift. Think it's time, the biker said, standing up slowly to start carrying a different kind of weight. The kind your uncle talked about, the weight of responsibility to each other, to be better than what fear and anger make us. The evening had settled into O'Malley's bar and grill like a gentle tide, washing away the tensions of earlier hours. The biker stood up slowly, reaching into his pocket and pulling out his wallet again. This time, he took out a crisp bill. Bartender, he called out, his voice carrying a new kind of authority, not the threatening kind from before, but something warmer. I'd like to buy a round of drinks for everyone here. Soft drinks, coffee, whatever they prefer. And, he turned to the sergeant, I'd like to make a toast. The bartender nodded, beginning to prepare drinks as people gathered closer. Even folks who'd been ready to leave stayed, sensing that something important was about to happen. Been coming to this bar for 15 years, the biker said, looking around the room. Made it unwelcoming for a lot of good people. That changes tonight. He picked up his glass of water, holding it high. To the doc, a man who saved more than just bodies. He saved souls. The sergeant raised his glass too, and soon everyone in the bar joined in. The younger bikers, their vests now plain leather without the hateful patches, stood tall beside their mentor. You know, the older biker continued, Your uncle once told me that change is like a sunrise. It starts slow, just a little light at first, but once it begins, there's no stopping it. He looked down at his now bare vest. Guess today's my sunrise. He reached into the paper bag holding the removed patches and walked to the fireplace that had been cold all summer. Bartender, mind if we light this up? Think it's time for a proper burning. The bartender smiled, reaching for some matches. Been waiting 15 years to light this fireplace in summer. As the patches caught fire, curling and turning to ash, someone started humming Amazing Grace, the same song the doc had sung in that burning helicopter so many years ago. Others joined in, the sound swelling until it filled the bar with harmony. The sergeant watched the flames, then turned to the biker. My uncle would be proud of this moment. Not just of you, but of all of us here. This is what he fought for, not just survival, but understanding. The younger bikers approached the sergeant, each offering sincere apologies for their earlier behavior. But he waved them off. The best apology is changed behavior, he said, quoting something his uncle used to say. The bartender cleared his throat, getting everyone's attention. Starting tonight, O'Malley's has a new tradition. Every Thursday will be Veterans Night. All service members welcome, no matter who they are or where they're from. We'll share stories, remember the ones we've lost, and maybe, he looked at the biker and the sergeant, help a few more sunrises happen. As the evening wound down, people began to leave, but differently than they came. There were handshakes, some hugs, exchanges of phone numbers. The biker squad didn't roar off on their motorcycles like usual. They walked them quietly down the street, showing respect for the neighborhood. Before leaving, the older biker turned to the sergeant one last time. Your uncle, he said, his voice rough with emotion, he never gave up on seeing the good in people. Took me 40 years to prove him right. He extended his hand. Thank you for giving me that chance. The sergeant shook his hand firmly. Same time next Thursday. The biker nodded, a genuine smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. Wouldn't miss it. Got a lot of years of stories to catch up on. As they parted ways under the stars, O'Malley's bar and grill stood quiet but changed. The old neon sign buzzed softly, casting a gentle glow on the sidewalk where just hours before, hatred had walked in and understanding had walked out. Inside, the bartender picked up the photograph the sergeant had left for him to display. A piece of history that would now hang proudly behind the bar, reminding everyone that change is always possible, and it's never too late to learn the lessons of brotherhood.